How long did ancient humans actually live? She is the oldest person in the group. She has been the oldest person in the group for approximately 15 years, which means she has outlived two previous oldest persons and shows no particular signs of being done with the project. She is somewhere between 55 and 65 years old, which is genuinely difficult to estimate from the outside, because she has spent her entire life doing hard physical work in variable weather conditions and looks accordingly. Her hair is gray. Her face has the lines that come from decades of sun and wind, and the specific kind of sustained concentration required to read an environment that will kill you if you misread it. Her hands are the most competent hands in the group. Everyone in the group knows this. She knows where the water sources are during a drought. Not the obvious ones, which dry up, but the deep ones hidden under certain rock formations in a particular geological configuration that took her 30 years to map completely. She knows which plants become toxic during specific seasonal conditions, a fact that is not obvious from looking at them, and that took her people several deaths across several generations to establish. She knows how the animals in this landscape behave before a major weather change, and she starts moving the group slightly before anyone else thinks it's time. And she is right about this with a consistency that long ago stopped seeming like coincidence. She is the most valuable person in the group, not the strongest. The one who has been there the longest accumulated the most, and can transfer what she knows to everyone who comes after her. You can see this in action on a specific morning 3 weeks ago. The group is moving toward a water source that has sustained them through 3 previous dry seasons. The younger hunters are confident about the direction. The source has been reliable. There is no obvious reason to change course, she says. Not that way. She says it quietly, the way she says most things, without drama or extended explanation. She has seen a particular configuration of dry, cracked soil, a specific pattern of animal tracks that are absent where they should be present, a shift in the vegetation at the edge of her sightline that she has seen once before. In a season she was approximately 30 years old. That season, the source was dry. There is a discussion. The younger members of the group are skeptical. The source has never failed in their memory. She says, I know. They go her way. 2 hours further than planned, they find water. Nobody comments on this directly. There is no ceremony. The group drinks, fills what they carry, makes camp. But the youngest hunter, watching her settle near the fire that evening, files something away that he could not have articulated yet. Something about the specific way she moved her eyes across the landscape that morning. Something worth learning to do. And according to the statistic you probably learned in school, she should have been dead for 25 years. The number is 30. Average life expectancy in prehistoric times, approximately 30 years. You have seen this number in textbooks, in documentaries, in casual conversations about how brutal and short ancient life was. It is technically accurate. It is also one of the most misleading statistics in common circulation. Here is what the number actually measures. Average life expectancy at birth is calculated by taking the ages at death of everyone in a population and computing the mean. If you have a population where 10% of children die before their first birthday, another 20% die before their 5th birthday, and the survivors live to 60 or 70, the average age at death across the whole population will be somewhere in the 30s or early 40s, depending on the exact proportions. This does not mean most people died at 30. It means a very large number of people died very young, and this pulled the average down dramatically. A simple way to see why this matters: imagine a classroom of 10 children. 2 of them die before age 5. The remaining 8 live to an average of 65. The average age at death across all 10 children is not 65. It's approximately 52. If you increase the early deaths, 4 children instead of 2, with 6 survivors who still live to 65, the average drops to 39. 6 times 65 divided by 10. Not 47. 39. In a prehistoric population with high infant and child mortality, the math works the same way. You can have a population where no adult dies before 50 and still have an average life expectancy at birth of 30-something if enough children die young. The statistic accurately describes the population's mortality pattern. It does not accurately describe how long adults lived. Now add one more layer. In prehistoric conditions, the mortality rate in early childhood wasn't just high, it was extraordinarily high by modern standards. Estimates based on archaeological demographic data and comparisons with modern forager populations suggest that somewhere between 30 and 50% of children born in Paleolithic populations did not survive to their 5th birthday. Some estimates are higher. The pathogens, the lack of medical intervention, the nutritional vulnerability of early childhood, the exposure to environmental hazards. The gauntlet between birth and age 5 was the most dangerous period of the entire human lifespan, which means that almost half of all the deaths recorded in a prehistoric population happened before the people involved were old enough to have memories of their own life. Strip those deaths out of the calculation. Look only at people who survived to adulthood, and the picture changes substantially. The survivors, the people who made it through the catastrophically dangerous gauntlet of early childhood, had a completely different life expectancy. Michael Gervin and Hillard Kaplan at the University of New Mexico published a comprehensive study in 2007 examining longevity data from a broad range of hunter-gatherer and subsistence agricultural populations, including the Hadza of Tanzania, the Kung of the Kalahari, the Aki of Paraguay, and numerous others. They were trying to reconstruct what adult life expectancy looked like when infant and child mortality was removed from the calculation. The results were considerably less grim than the 30-year number implies. Adults who survived to age 15 in these populations had a median additional life expectancy of approximately 40 more years. That puts median adult lifespan at around 55. A meaningful proportion of those adults, roughly 10 to 20%, survived into their 60s and 70s. Exceptional individuals reached their 80s. The pattern was consistent across the populations they studied. It was not unusual. It was the normal distribution of adult lifespans in populations living without modern medicine. The 30-year number describes what the world was like when large numbers of children died before adulthood. It does not describe what happened to the adults. Adults lived considerably longer. The fossil record has been catching up to this picture over the past 2 decades. In 2004, a paleoanthropologist named Rachel Kaspari at Central Michigan University published a study that examined a question nobody had systematically asked before. How common were old adults in different periods of human prehistory? She and her colleague Sang-Hee Lee developed a method for estimating age at death from dental wear patterns in fossil specimens, then applied it to a large sample of hominin fossils spanning from early human relatives through the Upper Paleolithic. The findings showed a striking pattern: the ratio of older adults to younger adults in the fossil record. What Kaspari called the OY ratio, for old to young, increased dramatically over the course of human evolution, with the most dramatic increase occurring in the Upper Paleolithic, the period associated with the emergence of fully modern human behavior. This means that not only did modern humans live longer than their predecessors on average, but the proportion of the population that was genuinely old enough to have grandchildren, old enough to carry decades of accumulated knowledge, increased substantially during exactly the period when human culture became most complex. Kaspari's interpretation: the increase in older adults was not incidental to the behavioral revolution of the Upper Paleolithic. It was part of it. More grandparents meant more knowledge transmission, more intergenerational learning, more cultural accumulation. The old woman at the beginning of this story wasn't a statistical anomaly. She was a feature of the system. Now consider the grandmother hypothesis. Kristen Hawkes, an anthropologist at the University of Utah, has spent decades developing and testing an idea about why human females undergo menopause. Why? Unlike almost every other mammal, human women stop reproducing while they still have significant life ahead of them. Almost all other mammals reproduce until they die, or until their bodies are simply too depleted to continue. The cessation of reproduction while the body is still healthy and capable of other activities is unusual. Hawkes and her colleagues noticed, while studying the Hadza in Tanzania, that post-menopausal women were among the most productive food providers in the community. They worked longer hours gathering food than younger women with dependent children, and the food they gathered went primarily to their grandchildren. The hypothesis: post-reproductive women increase the survival of their existing grandchildren more effectively by redirecting energy from new reproduction to intensive provisioning and care of the grandchildren they already have. Natural selection, operating over hundreds of thousands of years, shaped human female longevity by favoring women who lived longer after menopause and used that time productively. In the populations Hawkes and her colleagues studied, the presence of an active grandmother in the household measurably improved child nutrition and survival. When maternal grandmothers were present and active, grandchildren were better nourished. When maternal grandmothers were absent or incapacitated, grandchildren showed worse nutritional outcomes. The effect was specific to maternal grandmothers, the mother's mother, and was measurable, consistent, and significant. Grandmothers in forager groups were not peripheral figures who had aged out of usefulness and were being maintained out of sentiment. They were active economic contributors whose presence had direct, measurable consequences for child survival rates. The group wasn't keeping elderly women alive out of compassion. The group was benefiting from them being alive. Menopause in this framing is not a design flaw or a byproduct of living longer than the reproductive system expected. It is an adaptation. It exists because post-reproductive women who put their energy into grandchildren left more surviving descendants than women who continued reproducing until they couldn't anymore. The human female lifespan, with its extended post-reproductive period that can last 30 or 40 years, was shaped by selection for exactly this kind of multi-generational investment. You cannot have a grandmother hypothesis without grandmothers, and you cannot have grandmothers without people living long enough to be grandmothers. The ancient human lifespan wasn't just long enough to include old people. It was shaped in part by the survival advantages that old people provided. Now meet someone who should not have been alive by any intuitive estimate of what prehistoric survival looked like. The skeleton known as Shanidar I was excavated from Shanidar Cave in what is now Iraqi Kurdistan and dates to somewhere between 45 and 75,000 years ago. This was a Neanderthal individual, one of our closest evolutionary relatives who had sustained injuries and conditions that would have been, in a world of pure physical competition and individual survival, thoroughly disqualifying. His right arm had been severely injured and showed evidence of either traumatic amputation or severe withering. The bones of the forearm and hand showed dramatic reduction, suggesting the limb was either non-functional or missing entirely. He had healed fractures to his skull, suggesting significant head injuries. He appeared to have degenerative joint disease affecting his lower limbs. He was likely partially blind from the skull damage, and he had lived, based on skeletal analysis, to somewhere between 35 and 50 years old, which, in Neanderthal demographic terms, was old. Genuinely old. He survived to old age with injuries and conditions that made him dependent on his group for food, for care, for protection against threats he could not adequately defend himself against alone. His group kept him alive, whether through what we would call compassion or through practical calculations about the knowledge and social value he provided despite his limitations, or through some combination, the group sustained someone who could not have sustained himself. This is not unique in the fossil record. Evidence of healed severe injuries in ancient specimens is common enough that it represents a pattern rather than an exception. Broken bones that healed correctly requiring weeks of immobility and therefore external support. Severe dental abscesses that required someone to provide already processed food. Conditions that would have made normal forager activities impossible without group support. The fossil record of ancient humans is, in part, a record of groups keeping their damaged members alive. Not every group, not always, but consistently enough to show up repeatedly in the bones. So what actually killed ancient humans, if not simply running out of time at 30? The leading causes of death in prehistoric populations were not old age, and they were not the degenerative diseases of aging that account for most mortality in modern developed countries. They were the things that killed quickly and unpredictably, the things that modern medicine has largely neutralized. Infection was the primary killer across all age groups. A wound that became infected was a serious threat in a world without antibiotics. What would now be treated with a course of oral medication in 3 to 5 days could become septicemic in 2 weeks and kill an otherwise healthy adult. Respiratory infections, gastrointestinal infections, parasites. These killed both young and old, but killed children most efficiently, because children had not yet built immunity to the endemic pathogens of their environment. There is an uncomfortable paradox here. The child who survived repeated infectious challenges in early life, who got sick and recovered, got sick again and recovered again, emerged from that process with a hardened, experienced immune system. The immune memory accumulated through childhood illness was the closest thing available to vaccination in a world without vaccines. The children who died were, in a brutal statistical sense, those whose immune systems couldn't meet the challenge. The survivors were those whose immune systems couldn't meet the challenge. The survivors were those whose immune systems could. But it does explain why adults who made it through childhood were often physically robust in ways that skeletal analysis confirms. The survivors of ancient childhood were not the weakest of their generation. Injury killed hunters and gatherers at rates that varied by activity, season, and the specific demands of the landscape. Falls, animal encounters, interpersonal conflict within and between groups. These were not rare events. A broken bone in a world without orthopedic surgery depended entirely on whether the break was clean, whether it healed correctly, and whether the group could support the injured person through the weeks of reduced mobility required for bone union. The fossil record shows that many of them did heal. Healed fractures in ancient skeletal material are common. Old healed injuries, a rib broken and regrown, a wrist that knit with a slight angle, a skull that reformed after a serious blow, appear repeatedly across prehistoric specimens. These healed injuries are evidence of two things simultaneously. That injury was common, and that survival from injury was also common, often because the group provided the support that individual recovery required. Childbirth was consistently among the leading causes of death for women of reproductive age. The specific geometry of human birth, a large-headed infant navigating a birth canal narrowed by bipedal locomotion, created a delivery challenge that killed mothers and infants at rates that modern obstetric care has dramatically reduced. This was real, significant mortality, but it was not evenly distributed across the lifespan. It was specific to reproductive age women in the period around delivery. Women who survived their reproductive years and entered post-reproductive life had, in terms of this specific risk, cleared the most dangerous stretch of their adult lifespan. There is one more cause of death worth acknowledging, because it rarely makes it into the popular narrative of prehistoric life: old age itself. People did reach ages where the body's accumulated wear produced conditions that shortened the remaining lifespan. Joints that no longer functioned, teeth so worn that eating became progressively difficult, immune systems that had spent decades responding to challenges and had less reserve remaining. Ancient humans did age. The skeletons show it. They died of what we would now describe as age-related conditions. The point is that they reached those ages in numbers large enough to leave substantial evidence. Here is an irony that the 30-year myth completely obscures. When humans began farming, approximately 10,000 years ago, average health outcomes got worse before they got better. Considerably worse, and for a considerable time. The skeletal record of early agricultural populations, compared to the forager populations that preceded them in the same geographic areas, tells a consistent story. Agricultural people were shorter, stature being a direct marker of nutritional quality during childhood and adolescence, specifically protein adequacy and the absence of prolonged nutritional stress. They had more dental cavities, because grain-based diets high in fermentable carbohydrates create conditions that favor the bacteria that cause tooth decay. They showed more evidence of iron deficiency anemia, visible in characteristic changes to skull bone. They showed more evidence of infectious disease, because settled populations living near their own waste and near domesticated animals were exposed to a range of pathogens that mobile hunter-gatherer groups were not. Clark Larson at Ohio State University has spent decades systematically documenting this health transition in skeletal populations across the agricultural transition. His findings are consistent across multiple continents and multiple periods. The transition from foraging to farming made individual humans measurably less healthy for several thousand years before improved agricultural productivity, better food storage, and eventually medical infrastructure began to reverse the trend. The people often described as living brutish, short lives, the hunter-gatherers, were, by multiple skeletal health indicators, physically more robust than the people who came after them and eventually built civilization. Their lives were harder in some respects, less food secure, without the surplus accumulation that allows specialization and technology and written records. But the bodies they lived in were, on average, less diseased. This doesn't mean farming was a mistake. It means that the narrative of human progress as a straight line from brutal primitive to modern civilized is considerably more complicated than the 30-year myth suggests, and that the people the myth most misrepresents, the hunter-gatherers themselves, were in many respects more physically capable and longer lived as adults than the populations that followed them. Now think about what that means for the people the myth erases most completely. The elderly, in the popular imagination of prehistoric life, shaped in part by the 30-year number, old people barely existed. Ancient life was young life, hunters in their prime, mothers in their reproductive years, children who either survived to contribute or died before they could. Grandparents were a luxury the system couldn't afford. The evidence says something different. The Caspary data shows that old adults became more common over the course of human evolution, peaking in the Upper Paleolithic, the period of our most complex cultural behavior. Hawkes's data shows that old women were active, productive, and consequential for group outcomes. The Shanidar individual shows that even severely disabled adults were sustained by their groups through old age in populations far older than our own species. And there is one more piece. Knowledge. A hunter-gatherer group is a knowledge system. Its survival depends on accumulated information about the landscape, the seasons, the animals, the plants, the water sources, the weather patterns, the other groups in the area. This knowledge cannot be written down. It has to live somewhere. It lives in the people who have been there the longest. The man who remembers which berry saved the group during the famine 30 years ago, The one that looks almost identical to the poisonous variety, but grows on slightly higher ground. That knowledge does not exist in any other form. The woman who can read the track pattern that tells you a leopard has been moving through this area for 3 days rather than passing through once. Her pattern recognition was built across 50 years of observation and cannot be reconstructed from scratch. These people were not a drain on the group's resources. They were the group's most sophisticated survival tool. Losing them to early death was, in terms of the group's ability to navigate the next difficult year, catastrophic in a way that losing a young hunter simply wasn't. Young hunters are replaceable. What the oldest person in the group knows is not replaceable. It goes with them. Natural selection, operating over hundreds of thousands of years, understood this even when we didn't. It built a lifespan long enough to accumulate that knowledge and keep it alive long enough to transmit it. Go back to the woman at the beginning. She is 55 to 65 years old. She knows where the water is during a drought. She knows which plants kill you under certain conditions. She knows how to read the landscape before a storm. She has been the oldest person in the group for 15 years. The number 30 doesn't describe her. It doesn't describe the people who died of infection before they turned 5. It doesn't describe the hunters who survived injuries and lived to tell their grandchildren about them. It doesn't describe the Neanderthal with one arm who made it to 50 in Shanidar Cave with his group keeping him alive. What it describes is the outcome of a world without childhood vaccines, without antibiotics, without clean water infrastructure. A world where early death was common and where the people who survived early death often lived far longer than the average suggests. The number 30 tells you about the deaths that happened. It doesn't tell you about the lives that didn't. The woman who knows where the water is, who has been there the longest, who is the most valuable person in the group. She is what ancient human longevity actually looked like when it worked. Not a brief candle, a slow burn, banked carefully, that lasted longer than the number ever implied.